In today's lab, we're going to be talking about different cell types, specifically the epithelial tissues, which make up our skin, and the connective tissues, which are one of the 4 groups that we classify all cells. Now, in lecture, I'm hoping you're learning about stem cells and undifferentiated cells. So, in the beginning, when you're just a fertilized egg, all your genes are turned on, they're available, they're not shut off yet. So when you divide your cell, each of the genes is still available. And then as you go along and you divide your cells, you're doing mitosis, you're dividing, at some point the cell will differentiate and it will decide, I'm going to be a muscle cell. And so it's going to turn off the genes that don't have to do with being a muscle cell. And then some of the cells are going to decide, well, I'm going to be a bone cell. And so it turns off the genes that don't have anything to do with being a bone cell. So that's what they're talking about with differentiation. Of the trillions of cells in our body, there's only about 200 different kinds. And we can take those 200 different kinds of cells and group them into 4 groups. So they are the epithelial, which you and I would call skin cells, connective tissue, which is pretty much anything else that's not nervous or muscular tissue. So it's kind of a catch-all group. Your outer and inner skin cells are squamous epithelial cells, and they're nice, shaped, flat. They kind of look like a fried egg. Squamous is squished cells. This happens to be a picture right here of a tumor that's growing. This is a squamous cell carcinoma. Here are normal squamous epithelial cells. And this is probably what the squamous epithelial cells will look like if you're looking at them under the microscope in the laboratory. These are taken from the side, so you've taken a cross section, you cut down into the tissue, into the skin. Here's the dead outer layers, and those cells are flat. When you look at cells under the microscope, you will notice that you don't just have one cell type. So in this one, we have several of our cell types we're going to be studying today. We're going to be studying the squamous, we're going to be doing cuboidals, and then we're going to get into connective tissue. So here's some of the connective tissue that we'll be looking at a little bit later. So on one slide, you can find different cell types that we're going to be learning today. A second type of epithelial cells are the cuboidals. So they are exactly what they say. They're cube-shaped, like dice or cubes of cheese. They're generally forming ducts, tubules, and they're secreting things. So usually when you see things like this, they're going to be squirting something out. Sometimes cuboidal cells look like little rocks or little pebbles, but usually you find them in rings. So here's a ring of cuboidal cells, here's a ring of cuboidal cells, because remember they're squirting something, so they are going to usually squirt it into some sort of a duct or a tube so that it can go on down like sweat, saliva. And then when you get into the kidneys, you'll learn a lot more about cuboidal cells and their function in making urine. And the third major type of epithelial cells are the columnar. So they're going to be tall, rectangular, and we're going to find that there's several different variations of the columnar epithelial cells. Now, before I forget, the cells, the squamous epithelial cells, the cuboidal cells, the columnar cells, if there's just one layer, like here there's just one layer, here's one tall skinny cell, here's one tall skinny cell. So if it's just one cell layer thick, then we say it's simple. So this would be simple cuboidal, simple columnar epithelium. And the one we saw before was simple cuboidal. Now, the one we saw of skin was not simple, because you saw layer after layer of the squamous epithelial cells. So you saw one layer laying on top of another. So it looked like somebody just fried a whole bunch of eggs and stacked them on top of each other. So you have the flat squamous. So if you have multiple layers, stratified, here's the word stratified, more than a single layer. So squamous epithelium, cuboidal, columnar. I don't think you're going to have any trouble with those. Squished flat, shaped like a cube, shaped like a column. One layer or multiple layers. Stratified, multiple layers. Where you're going to get into something a little bit weird is the pseudo-stratified. So pseudo-stratified is fake stratified. So it's really one single layer of cells, but because of where the nucleus is, it makes it look like it's several layers of cells. So let's look at the difference between simple columnar cells and pseudo-stratified columnar cells, because if you look at the two of them, one right after the other, then it's pretty easy to notice what's going on. Now, one of the things that you need to know, besides just what the shape is you need to know where would I go find that kind of tissue and what is its function in that particular place. This particular picture right here happens to be from the intestines. You can notice here's the nuclei all lined up kind of like soldiers in a row right there. And if you look from here to here, you can see that these are columnar cells. So you can see they're tall, skinny, and their nucleus is kind of squished skinny because they are tall and skinny. But another thing that gives away that this happens to be from the intestines are these little areas right here. Here's one right there, there's one right there, and they open to the outside out here, or what we call the lumen, L-U-M-E-N, the lumen, or the opening or the middle part of your intestines. That would be where your food goes through and where your poop is forming inside, or your feces, if you want to be correct. So these right here are called goblet cells. So I think maybe the person who named it might have been drinking at the time, because that doesn't look like any goblet that I ever drank out of. But anyway, if you see one that's clear looking, it's full of mucus. So mucus, we use other words like phlegm and snot and things like that for mucus. But anyway, so this is a goblet cell that's making mucus. And this is good because we don't want our food to get stuck in our intestines. We want it to just slide on through, and we want to absorb nutrients out of it, and then anything we don't need, then it's going to pass out as feces. So you're gonna make a poop, getting rid of the extra stuff. So these goblet cells are very nice for lubricating the intestines. So it says right here, make sure that you know goblet cells. So number 1 is a goblet cell. Number 2 is a nucleus. So any one of these things along here is a nucleus. And then they have microvilli. Well, that's kind of not fair, because they're pointing right there and saying, oh, look, there's the microvilli. Well, you can't see them with a light microscope. You have to have an electron microscope to see microvilli. So let's go look at some. I kind of like this picture because you can easily see these finger-like projections. So here I have food going through my intestines, and I need to absorb some of the nutrients. So those columnar cells are very good at absorbing things, and we already said the goblet cells are good for moving stuff along. But I don't want the food to come in my mouth, go down into my stomach, and then go into my intestines and come out the other end in a few minutes. I want it to stay in there at least 8 hours or so, and so I have an opportunity to break down the food and absorb the things that I need. So the way you can slow down the food that's moving through your intestines is to actually take proteins, stick them up through the cell membrane, and make these extensions. So these are microvilli, or little fingers sticking up there. And so now the food is going to be going around and through and around and through, and so you can absorb stuff. So they have an arrow saying number 3 is microvilli, but you actually can't see them. So you get frustrated if you think this is what it's going to look like under your light microscope, because it's not. So there it says the function of those cells is absorption. So these cells are doing the absorbing of food, and the secretion is being done by these goblet cells that are interspersed along there. So let's go look at some pseudostratified. Let's see if I can make that bigger for you. Okay, pseudostratified. So when you look at pseudostratified, here's the problem. When you're looking, the nuclei are kind of up and down and up and down. And let's see if we can find a... So here's a picture that's not quite as faded out. So let's see what we recognize. Okay, I recognize these columnar cells. They look like tall, skinny columns. I definitely recognize the goblet cells. So these are the ones that are secreting mucus. So they're making a kind of a gooey film. So everything moves along there. But if you look, you think, oh, look, there's a row of nuclei right there, and here's a row of nuclei right there. So that must be 2 layers. But if you were to zoom in a little tighter and look at it, you're going to see that here's the top of the cell, and there's the bottom of the cell. Here's the top of this cell, there's its nucleus, and there's the bottom of that cell right there. So this is 1 cell layer thick, but the nucleus has got you tricked into thinking it's 2 layers. But you have to look very, very carefully. This is the picture that's in your lab manual. Again, no problem seeing the goblet cells. And number 2, the nuclei. So there's a nucleus right there. And there's a nucleus right there. So you can see the nuclei, but they're up and down, up and down, up and down. So again, it tricks you into thinking that it's layered, but it's simple columnar epithelium. But we call it pseudostratified because it looks like it's multiple layers, but it really, really is not. Okay, so the other thing that you need to look at in this particular sample is you can see little hair-like projections sticking up here. So these are not microvilli because you can't see them. You cannot see microvilli using our light microscopes. But if you're using this tissue and you're looking with the light microscope, you can see those little hair-like cilia. So these are cilia, not microvilli. So I want to make sure that you have those 2 things straight. So number 3 is the cilia. This particular piece of tissue happens to come from the trachea. But if you look at the uterine tubes, which are also called fallopian tubes, they're trying to rename everything, so uterine tubes are now fallopian tubes. But these cells are squirting out mucus into your trachea. And if you guys, you haven't learned about the trachea yet, but that is your windpipe. And everyone knows periodically you get sick and you're coughing up loogies or goobers. People have different names for the mucus, but these things are going to be making a lot of mucus, and you're going to have other cells that are putting fluids into your trachea. So the irritation of whatever you've caught, whatever disease that you've caught, is going to cause extra mucus. And so you're going to be coughing up a lot of that. And sometimes you get hoarse. So I want to just tell you just a second, because this should be taught in your lecture class, but I haven't seen people teaching it. And I've had too many people in my family die of lung cancer. So I just want to spend just a little second talking to you about these cilia that are in the trachea. The object of the game is for these cilia to beat in unison, in a wave, and push the mucus that's coming out of these goblet cells, up. And if you go push it up, 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 like you're going towards the mouth, eventually you're going to get to the larynx, and you're going to get to an area where you can push the mucus up and then send it down into the esophagus and down into the stomach. So you can get rid of the mucus that's being secreted here. And the reason that you're doing mucus here is not to lubricate poop like you're doing in the intestines or feces, but I need to get all of the stuff that I'm breathing in that is not okay, like COVID. Somebody coughed on me and I got COVID in my mouth and my nose and my throat, or somebody has the flu and they're coughing, or I'm out and there's spores in the air, and so I get the spores in there. Worm eggs. Oh, there's just all kinds of things. Pollen. You don't want that down in your lungs. So you've got this mucus to lubricate and moisten the airway, and these little cilia pushing up, up, up towards your mouth until you get up to where the opening of the esophagus is, and you dump all that mucus and all the junk that you've collected in the mucus into the esophagus and on down into the stomach, and the stomach acid will take care of most of the stuff that you've breathed in. Now, if you're a smoker, then it paralyzes these cilia. So you're still going to be making the mucus with these goblet cells, but now because the cilia are paralyzed, then they're not pushing the mucus up, and gravity just makes it all slide down into your lungs. So anybody who's ever been around someone who's a smoker, if you're around them in the morning when they wake up, all night long, they've had mucus sliding down into their lungs, and so their lungs fill up with fluid, and when they wake up, they have to cough all of that up. So you've heard people who are smokers, and they have that horrible, horrible cough. And when you go to the doctor and you got a horrible cough, they'll say, well, are you a smoker? And you say, nope. And then they go, okay, then it must be because you have the flu or RSV or, one of the other COVID things going around. So don't smoke. And if you continue to smoke, then what will happen is these cells will still divide and form, but you don't even bother making the cilia anymore. So you kind of have bald cells. So if you go to your doctor and say, oh, no, I don't smoke. Not me, nope. All you got to look and see that the cilia are gone. They go, yes, you do, because your cilia are gone. So take-home message there, don't smoke. If you're following along with me in your lab manual, I'm skipping the picture right before this and going into the last type of columnar cells that we want you to know. So we had squamous, cuboidal, and columnar, and then we had ciliated columnar, we had pseudostratified columnar, and now I want to talk about transitional epithelium. I like this picture a little bit better than the one in the lab manual because I can see it a little bit easier. But what you're looking at in transitional epithelium is you're looking at columnar cells, but you have certain tissues that stretch out and shrink down. Now your bladder is a classic example. Think about when you finish peeing, then you've emptied your bladder and it shrinks up, it just shrivels up, and it kind of looks like this. If you were to take your bladder and take a slice of it and put it under the microscope, this is kind of what you would be looking at. Now, if you're sitting there and you're watching my video and you're like, oh, this is so exciting, I can't wait to know the next thing, and your bladder is filling up and you're getting a little more squirmy and needing to go pee, what's going to happen is your bladder is going to stretch out and fill up with urine, and then these things will stretch out and they'll start looking like columnar cells, just the regular columnar cells. But when they're shriveled up like this, because your bladder has shrunk, then if you look, it kind of looks like, I think it looks like peacock's tails. So you can see there, it looks like a peacock's tail and a peacock's tail there, like that. But now in your mind, just take these cells and pull them out, stretch them out, and you'll see them stretch out and look like the columnar cells that we have seen before. So transitional epithelium is usually not just one cell layer thick, because we need it to be able to stretch out without, if it was just one cell layer thick, it'd be pretty easy to tear. So I don't want my bladder tearing. That would be not something I want with my urine leaking out into my body. So the ureters that are going to take the urine into the bladder, those are also lined with transitional epithelium. Their function is to stretch and recoil. So fill your bladder up, empty it out. So it's kind of elastic in effect, or stretchy in effect. You should know that all these little dots that you see, those are all nuclei. And let's see if I can get this a little bit bigger. You can sort of see that peacock tail looking here, right there. It's not quite as dramatic as it is in the other picture that I showed you. But and this area right here is the lumen, or the hole, that is your bladder or your ureters. You also have it in the urethra. So let's go back and look at the picture that I skipped over. So this one is the squamous epithelial cells, but they're showing you the layers of the squamous epithelial cells. So here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer, here's a layer. So you have many, many layers. So where would you find this? You find the lining in your mouth, your throat, which is your esophagus. Ladies, we have this lining our vagina. So where you're going to find this is if you have something that rubs up against it and is going to be knocking layers of the cells off. So it's nice to have, after that layer is knocked off, you got another layer underneath it to protect you. And then if you rub that off or knock those cells off, then you have another layer underneath that. So when you think about eating something, so what I do is I think about eating a mouthful of peanuts. So I'm really fond of eating all sorts of cashews and other kinds of nuts. But you don't really think about it as you're chewing them up. They become very sharp. It's really interesting that as you're grinding them up in smaller pieces and smaller pieces, the shards of peanuts are very, very scratchy. So you're going to literally be knocking the layers of your mouth off and your throat as you swallow it. Now, most of us don't have any trouble, eating nuts, but there are some people in their intestines that they have little pockets. Diverticulitis, you may have heard of people talk about that. And those little pieces of nuts, the little shards of nuts, get down into those little pockets and they hurt. They really do, because they don't have the layers and layers that people who don't have diverticulitis have. So people with diverticulitis, they don't eat things like strawberries. And you think, what in the world? Strawberries are soft and mushy. But they aren't. They actually have those little black seeds on the outside of them. And again, if you have layers and layers and layers of cells, then those little black seeds rub up against, knock some cells off, no problem. You got another layer underneath it. It's stratified, so you're protected. So anyway, the function of having multiple layers of squamous epithelial cells is to protect you from abrasion and then infection. So people who have diverticulitis oftentimes will develop an infection in their intestines, and then they're in trouble. So then they have to have special treatment for that. Okay, so the only thing you really need to know in this, if you see this, is, this is stratified squamous epithelial cells. And if you zoom in, you can see a little bit better the layers. But it's kind of hard to see because you're looking at fried egg-shaped cells from the side, the flat side. So it's really hard to see, but there's a nucleus right there. I mentioned at the beginning that all of your cells can be put into 4 categories. So we just did the skin cells, the epithelial cells. And you'll notice that we talked about epithelial cells on the outside of the body, but we spent most of the time talking about epithelial cells on the inside of the body. So you have skin lining the outside of you, but you have skin lining your organs. You have it's on the inside of your trachea and your esophagus and your bladder. So you're going to find that you have skin cells lining the insides of most of your organs also. But when you talk about skin cells, all of us think, oh, you're just talking about the skin that I can see, the skin that I wash when I take my shower in the morning. Later on in the 7th or 8th lab that we're going to be doing, we're going to be talking about muscle cells and we're going to be talking about nerve cells. So if the cell that we're looking at is not a muscle cell, it's not a nerve cell, and it's not skin, it's not squamous, cuboidal, or columnar, then we throw it into a kind of a catch-all that is the connective tissue. So connective tissue is going to be blood, it's going to be cartilage, bone, your fat cells, mast cells. We're going to find out about what mast cells do, white blood cells. So all those things that don't fit in the skin, the muscle, and the nerve are connective tissue. So our next tissue type is called areolar connective tissue, and how it got its name I don't know, because most people, when you think of the areola, think of the colored ring around the nipple. But this type of areolar connective tissue has mast cells in it, M-A-S-T, mast cells. And when you slap someone in the face, so here's someone that got slapped in the face, you can actually see the fingers raise up out of the skin. So you can see the imprint of the fingers. And this is largely due to the mast cells. So here's a picture of areolar connective tissue. And if you notice, you see little threads, and then you see little dark specks in here. So let's see if we can find a picture that's a little bit darker than this one. So here's a picture with a little bit more dye on it, so you can see the fibers and the various odds and ends in it a little bit more easily. So if you notice, there are some kind of thick fibers, like these thick fibers, and then there's some very fine purple fibers like this one. So these are collagen. The big thick ones are collagen, and the little thin ones are elastic fibers. So this is one of the things that allows our skin to be flexible. And then if you follow along, you'll see that there are little cells that are making these fibers, and those are fibroblasts making fibers. So that's kind of a no-brainer thing. But then you have the mast cells. So let's see if we can find one that even has more exciting mast cells. Here's another picture of areolar connective tissue, and here's a mast cell. It is full of little bags of histamine. And you guys know about histamine because when you get a cold, your nose gets all swollen, your eyes get swollen, your throat gets swollen. So this would be histamine being released. And what you usually do is you take an antihistamine, like Benadryl, to try and dry up the histamine effects so that you don't have all the fluid. Here's one even more close-up, and you can see the individual bags of histamine in those mast cells. So when somebody slaps you in the face, or you get hit in the face with a ball, or if you get stung by a bee, it's going to irritate these mast cells, and they're going to release the histamine, and you're going to have swelling in the area. There are reticular fibers that are found in this areolar connective tissue, but you really have trouble seeing them in this. We're going to look at some connective tissue that has a lot of the reticular fibers in it. But the ones that are very easy to see in this particular one is the thick collagen and then the really thin elastic. So what do you need to know? You need to know the fibroblast, or the name of the cells that are making these fibers. Where do you find areolar connective tissue? You find it underneath your skin. So that's why you're saying deep to the epithelium. So the epithelium is superficial on the surface, and then you go down below it, and you're going to find this areolar connective tissue. So that particular picture I showed you a minute ago was actually somebody who got hit in the face, but you can slap somebody on the back and leave your handprint on their back. So you've seen places that swell up and turn red. If bacteria get in and start nibbling around in there, then you're going to see zits or acne, and they swell up and turn red also. So release of histamine from mast cells can occur pretty much anywhere. But you also have areolar connective tissue around your organs. So it says it holds fluid and defensive cells, and so you can release fluids. If you release fluids into an area, it makes it easier for white blood cells to come into the area. So you're thinking, dang, why do I have to have swelling? And maybe I should take a lot of antihistamine to reduce the swelling. Well, there's a reason your body puts fluid into an area. It's to help it heal more quickly. This is a picture of fat cells, and the proper name for fat cells is adipose tissue. Adipose, A-D-I-P-O-S-E. Where do you have it? You have it under your eyes. You have it under your skin. It's one of the reasons why young people have such a youthful skin, and old people have wrinkly skin, because old people take away the adipose tissue that's under their skin, and so their skin wrinkles up. Here's an example of someone who's dissolved away the fat or the adipose tissue underneath their skin, and someone who has smooth, unlined face because of the layer of fat underneath their skin. What are some other places you find fat? Well, obviously in your hips and in your breast. But a lot of people don't realize that your kidneys sit in a great big pocket of fat. So that adipose tissue is extremely important for suspending your kidneys, helping to protect them because they're very fragile. That's one of the reasons it's against boxing regulations to reach around and do a kidney punch on someone, because it's so easy to damage the kidneys. So you have that layer of fat to hold and cushion and suspend your kidneys. A lot of times people who lose weight very, very rapidly end up dissolving that fat, and the kidneys drop, and you can actually get a kink in the tube coming out of your kidneys and cause kidney failure. So rapid weight loss is not a good idea. When you're looking at this tissue, it's really interesting because you don't see anything. You don't see fibers inside of there. You don't see the nucleus inside of there. Those cells are so full of fat. These adipose cells are so full of fat that they've actually squished the nucleus over to the corners. So over to the side, there's the nucleus squished over into the side. Here's a picture with a little bit more staining. So you notice you're seeing other kinds of cells over here, but these stand out. The fat cells are unmistakable. They're one of the easiest cells to find because they literally look like white and cotton balls. And there's the little teeny tiny nucleus right there. Here's the nucleus right there, squished over to the side. So interestingly enough, you have about the same amount of fat cells when you're a kid as you do when you're an adult. But when you look at people who are monstrously fat, you think, oh my gosh, they're growing so many fat cells. But They're not. They're keeping these cells, but they're making them larger and larger and filling them up with more and more fat. So why else would you want to have fat? Well, besides having smooth, beautiful skin, you can use that fat if you need energy. So you can dissolve the fat. You have enzymes, they'll break it down and convert it into energy for you. Cushioning, we talked about, like your kidneys sit in a cushion of fat. And insulation, it keeps us warm. So you'll notice that people who are fat rarely wear coats and sweaters and things because they have enough insulation to warm them up. I like this picture of reticular connective tissue better, I think, than the one in the lab manual because they use a different stain. The one in the lab manual uses a brown stain, and this one actually causes the reticular fibers to show up as black. And the reason I like that is because I know that when we talked about endoplasmic reticulum, we talked about ladies' purses. So a long time ago, women carried purses called reticules. Here's a picture of an Edwardian beaded purse, and you can see the kind of fishnet stocking effect. Here's another picture of a reticule. So those fishnet stocking fibers actually make a network or a scaffolding, and you're going to find cells within that scaffolding, so it holds the cells in place. So where would you find them? You're going to find them in the spleen, in the bone marrow, and especially in the lymph nodes. The cells that are suspended within the reticular fibers are called lymphoblasts. These are going to be your white blood cells. So when we learn the immune system and we learn about the lymphatic vessels and the lymph nodes, you're going to see that the fluid around our blood goes through this scaffolding, and the white blood cells have an opportunity to take out anything that shouldn't be there. One of the things that they do when they're looking for like cancer that it has metastasized is they'll feel the lymph nodes, and you can actually feel, because the lymph node has cancer within it and the white blood cells have caught it and they're trying to kill it. So that's one of the first places, like breast cancer. It'll spread over into the lymph node. So when they take a piece of the breast off to do a biopsy, sometimes they'll reach in and they'll take some of the lymph nodes out from under the arm to see if it's spread away from the breast and into the rest of the body. So the reticular fibers make up the meshwork or the fishnet stocking effect, and then you have the lymphoblasts that are hanging out within it. The next tissue that we're going to look at is called dense regular connective tissue, and this is going to be your tendons and your ligaments. If you've ever been eating a hamburger or something like that and you bite down on a gristle, that's what the tendons and ligaments. This is the dense connective tissue that you're biting down into, because when you take the meat, you're supposed to cut the tendons and ligaments off. And sometimes if they're in a hurry, they leave pieces of it and it gets ground up in your hamburger meat. So I always hate to get cheap cuts of meat that have gristles in it. Here's a picture of dense connective tissue that's a little bit better stained. You can see a little bit more detail in it. But if you remember back when we were looking at areolar connective tissue, and I said you have those thick fibers, and those are your collagen fibers, and then you have those really, really thin ones, and those are the elastic ones. Well, look, here's your thick fibers. There's your thick fibers. So that's collagen fibers. And they're being laid down by little fibroblasts. So here in your lab manual are the things we want you to know. They're densely packed, they're parallel to each other, and you can see the nuclei. you're going to learn, we're going to beat this into you, that ligaments hold bone to bone and tendons hold muscle to bone. So ligaments hold bone to bone and tendons hold muscles to bone. So we're going to hit that in just about every other lab that we do from now on until the end of the semester. So you're going to have that for sure. So you don't want your bones to swivel. If you were wobbling every time you tried to take a step with your bones because you had the connection between them that was loose, that would not be okay. We want them to be very, very tight. So watch a football player and watch the way that they get their legs going and dodging around. You don't want your legs to wobble when you're trying to weave in and around and you've got the ball and you're running with it. So you want to resist tensile forces and in a single direction. So I just want to keep walking without wobbling. I don't want stretchy material here. I want this to be very, very tight. Dense, irregular connective tissue is a little bit harder to distinguish. I used to try and come up with an explanation that would make it clear to my students what the difference between this one was and this one. I mean, easily you can see that these two are different. This is your regular connective tissue, and this is your dense, irregular connective tissue. And one of the students said, well, it looks like you dropped this slide and broke it. Everything got all scrambled up. And I thought, oh man, that is an excellent way of explaining it. So if you look, you've got the collagen fibers, but they're going in all different directions. So here's a little bit going off in that direction, a little bit going off in this direction. And so I need the strength, but I need to be able to move more than like you do for the tendons and ligaments. So where are you going to find this? You're going to find this in the lower layers of your skin, especially like in your hands, in your palms, because wiggle your hands around and you see that you've got to be able to bend the skin forward, backwards. You got to be able to stretch your fingers. So I need that to be strong. So if I pick up a big box, I don't want my skin and my hand to rip. I want it to be very, very strong. So I'm going to use collagen because it's one of the strong fibers that I can lay down under my skin to reinforce it. But I do need it to be able to, so I can clasp my hands and curl my fingers and pull my thumb across. So I'm going to put dense, irregular connective tissue. So again, you have collagen fibers. And if you look, you'll see the little cells that are laying down the collagen fiber. And when you see fibers being laying down, you know that the name of the cell is a fibroblast. A fibroblast. They make fibers. So the name's right there in the word fibroblast. It provides resistance against tensile forces in many directions. So basically it lets your skin move in different directions. That's what it's saying. And so if you put pressure on the skin, it's not going to be ripping. As you're studying this, you should compare and contrast the different kinds of tissue so that you see it and you go, oh, I remember that shape. Oh, I remember that shape. Well, this is collagen fibers, but mixed in amongst it is going to be elastic fibers. So if you follow this wavy line right here, that's an elastic fiber. It's going to be able to stretch. So here's another wavy line right there, and there's another wavy line right there. So you're going to find places that you need strength. So you have the collagen. So you can see the collagen fibers in there. But I also need it to have some elasticity. I need it to have a little bit of give in it. So when we're looking at this particular tissue, we're going to call this one elastic connective tissue because you've got a lot of the elastic fibers. So most tissues are going to have some collagen. Oops, sorry about that. When you learn about the heart, you're going to find that the heart contracts and pushes the blood out, and it hits the wall of the aorta. And that's the largest artery coming out of the heart. And if you don't have a lot of this elastic fiber in the lining of the aorta, then it can actually rip. So collagen's great and it gives it strength, but it doesn't give. So with this elastic fiber, I can actually cause the aorta to expand some so that the pressure of the blood hitting the wall doesn't tear a hole in it. So that's what's really important about that. So you're going to find it in the walls of blood vessels, but it's much more abundant in arteries. And this is probably a piece of an aorta. And it has collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and as always, anytime you see fibers being laying down, then you know that you have to have fibroblasts laying them down for you. Every time I think about elastic connective tissue, the first thing that pops in my mind is this Coban stuff. If you've ever had your blood drawn, they used to put a Band-Aid on you, but now they put this stretchy stuff. So they take a piece of that and stretch it out. And to me, that's exactly what the elastic connective tissue looks like under the microscope. It looks like you're looking at Coban. The next type of connective tissue we're going to look at is cartilage. And there are three kinds we're going to look at: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. So we're starting out with hyaline cartilage. Now this has been stained purple, but it actually is almost transparent. It's clear colored. When I think of hyaline cartilage, I think about the keel bone in a chicken. So I don't know, a lot of people had never seen a keel bone before, and I thought, well, I'll show you what one looks like right there. So it's kind of a translucent. If you put your finger under there, you can see your finger underneath that. So it's very, very transparent. But what's really interesting about cartilage is you have the cells that are laying down the cartilage, but they have a little bit of a problem because they're walling themselves off. It's kind of like painting yourself into a corner. So what these cells have to do is they have to leave a little lake in order to have fluid around them, to get nutrients in, and to get all the things they need and get rid of waste. So we call the lake a lacuna. A lacuna. So there's the little lake, and there's the cell growing in there. This one's divided, so we're going to be expanding this tissue out a little bit. So now I'm going to have two cells. So this one's going to have to go off and make its own lacuna. Here's one in a lacuna. So the name of the thing that is laying down the cartilage is a chondrocyte. So these chondrocytes live in the lacuna, the little lakes. Now this one is laying down the hyaline cartilage. So you've got collagen, but you don't have as much collagen because I don't need this to be as stiff. I need this to be actually a little bit rubbery feeling. So where are you going to find this? Your nose. So, wiggle your nose there. Your voice box. You can see your voice box, your larynx bouncing up and down. And your trachea. I need the trachea to be able to expand and contract, especially like when I have a cold, because you can get swelling in your trachea, and then you start wheezing and, sounding like that. The costal cartilages that you have around your ribs, we haven't studied our ribs yet, and the ends of your bones. If you really don't think too much about your bones, but you don't want the bones rubbing against each other, because then you'd have this really grinding sound. So some people actually lose the collagen or the cartilage on the ends of their bones, and their bones do rub together, and that's called crepitation, when your bones rub together. And they talk about people who are decrepit because their bones rub together. So we really need this covering over the ends of our long bones. So when we do the bones in a few weeks, that's one of the things we'll be talking about, the hyaline cartilage that covers the ends of the bones and keeps the bones from rubbing against each other. So we use them for structural support. I actually had a student who the septum in her nose had deteriorated to the point where her nose had collapsed and she couldn't breathe. And so she had to go in and have reconstructive surgery to put back the cartilage that was holding the shape of her nose. Now, there are people who do cocaine and they end up eating holes in the septum of their nose. People who are addicted to nose spray, like Dristan and Afrin and things like that. If you use it, it tells you on there, don't use this more than 3 days. But if you continue to use it, it'll actually eat the septum out of your nose. So I knew someone who was a church-going religious lady, but she was really addicted to Dristan, and she could put her finger in one side of her nose and stick it out the other side because she had eaten such a hole in her nose. As with all of the dense and irregular connective tissue and the cartilage, you're going to have collagen. That's just one of the constituents that makes it up. But in the case of hyaline cartilage, you have so little that you actually don't see those big ropey fibers. So it says right there, smooth, glassy appearance, distinctive lacuna, and therefore, cushioning joints and structural support. Collagen is present, but not visible. And each of these things is a lacuna with a chondrocyte living inside of it. So this particular one is laying down hyaline cartilage. This is going to be elastic cartilage. And in this one, you have the lacuna, and you have the little chondrocytes living in the lacuna. But what they're laying down, instead of hyaline cartilage, they're laying down elastic fibers. So we call this elastic cartilage. And this is places where you need something that is going to be very flexible. So your earlobe is one of the places that you're going to find elastic cartilage. So reach up and play with your earlobe and then play with your nose. And you can feel the difference between the hyaline cartilage and the elastic cartilage. So the elastic cartilage is much more flexible. And it says you see the collagen is present but not visible. So mostly you just see the elastic fibers. I kind of like this picture of elastic cartilage because you can easily see the fibers. Do you see the individual fibers there? And you notice that they're not straight. So a lot of times when you see collagen, you see these big ropey straight fibers, unless you're looking at dense irregular. But so this one I like because you can see that and you can easily see the lacuna in this particular picture. Right there. So kids ask me, what am I supposed to study when I read this chapter? Well, here's a nice little summary. Elastic cartilage is found in the earlobe and epiglottis. So when you ask that on the test, you'll see the slide and it'll say, what is this? And where would I find it? Or what is this? And what is its function? So if you cannot recognize this tissue, then you're not going to know what its function is either. So unfortunately, you could not understand what this slide is and miss 3 or 4 questions because you don't know it's found in the earlobe. You don't know that the reason that you have elastic cartilage is flexibility. And then you may not know that these are chondrocytes and they're laying down the elastic fibers. So learn this as a block of information. I think that'll be easier. All right, and then here's fibrocartilage. This one you can actually see the collagen. Now, in all the other slides we've been looking at, they've been staining the collagen kind of a pink or an orange color or a yellow color. But here they have a different stain, and they're staining it blue. So here's your collagen fibers right there, a little bit wavy, but not nearly as wavy as the elastic fibers were. And there's a lacuna, and there's the chondrocyte. So chondrocytes are the name of the cells that lay down the tissue, but some of them are laying down elastic fibers, some of them are laying down collagen fibers, reticular fibers. So we have different things that are being laid down, hyaline cartilage. So where do you find fibrocartilage? You're going to find this in the disc. When you talk about somebody's back and you say, oh my gosh, so-and-so slipped a disc, that's the pad of fibrocartilage that you have between your vertebra. So, and there's some fluid inside of them. So we'll learn more about that when we get into the back and the skeletal system. But intervertebral, between your vertebra, disc. So we call them disc for short. And then the pubic symphysis. So let's show you that. I assume everybody's looked at a picture of a skeleton before. And if you look, holding the two halves of the pubic bone together, the pelvic girdle together, right there, that's the pubic symphysis, right there. It holds those two pieces together. So it has to be really tight. Can you imagine if that ripped and let go and the two halves of your hips were able to independently move instead of having to move together? That would be a little bit scary. And there's those intervertebral disc right there. So this picture has both of them in it. So that's your fibrocartilage. I need it to be very strong. It can give just a little bit. Like when a woman's giving birth, it would be nice if this gave just a little bit to open this up, just a little bit to let the baby's head through. But most of the time you don't want this giving. You want it to be very, very strong. And anytime you think the word very, very strong, you immediately think of collagen. I know you're going to be shocked to find the lacuna with the chondrocyte in it, just like we had lacuna with chondrocyte in this one and lacuna with chondrocyte in this one. So you may be seeing a pattern up here. You have to know the chondrocyte and the lacuna. You have to know that the main fiber there is collagen, and it's to resist compressive forces. So I don't want my vertebra to be able to rub up against each other. And I certainly don't want the spinal cord, which is running through my vertebra, to get pinched. So I don't want it to be able to compress. If I pick up something heavy, I want it to resist compression so that I don't slip a disc. The meniscus of your knee we'll learn about that when we learn joints. You're going to see the meniscus. But you have a right and left meniscus in your knees, and they allow the upper bone to push against the lower two bones so that you have an extra pad. So you need more than just some hyaline cartilage in between those bones because you really punish your knees. Blood is another one of your connective tissues, and in this particular slide, you see the red blood cells right there. So they're the predominant thing that you're going to see. But if you look, every now and then you're going to see a cell that's a little bit bigger and has a nucleus that's stained purple in this particular case. Now, obviously, if you're looking at someone's blood, unless you put stain on it, your white blood cells are going to be colorless. That's why we call them white blood cells. And then the red blood cells are full of hemoglobin, so they're going to be bright red. Here's another picture of a blood smear. So there's your red blood cells right there. And notice how much bigger these cells are. So when we do blood in the next semester, one of the things you're going to do is you're going to be able to look at these and identify which type of white blood cell it is. So you have 5 major classes of white blood cells. So here, look at the nucleus. Aren't they funny looking? And that gives you a clue as to what kind of a white blood cell they are. And then you have platelets. Here's a platelet right there, and there's a platelet right there. And you guys know about platelets, they cause your blood to clot, but you're going to learn a lot more about it when you do the unit on blood. So this one should be pretty easy for you. There, it says, where would you find blood? Well, you would find it in your blood vessels, in your arteries, in your veins, in your capillaries. What is the function of blood? You transport nutrients. So we usually talk about blood transporting oxygen, and we definitely do that. The gases, the carbon dioxide and the oxygen are carried by the blood, but any of the food that you absorb out of your intestines has to go through the circulatory system and be dropped off at the various tissues that need the nutrients, and then you got to pick up the waste from outside the cells and carry that away. So what do you need to know? You need to know where there is not a cell, that you have plasma. You have the fluid in there. So you should have, well, women should have around 43 to 47% red blood cells and white blood cells, and then the rest of it should be plasma. Guys have more red blood cells than girls do, so theirs should be closer to like 47 to 52% of red blood cells, and then the rest of it plasma. But it depends on your age and depends on your athletic status, things like that. So what do you need to know else with that? You need to know the name of red blood cells is erythrocyte. Erythrocyte, that means red cell. And leukocyte means white cell. So you have red blood cells and you have white blood cells. So when they're talking about erythrocytes, they're talking about the red blood cells. And the last connective tissue that we're going to talk about is your bone tissue. And oh my goodness, look, we have lacuna. Man, we've seen those before, but you know, this time the lacuna have a different kind of cell inside because I'm not laying down cartilage, I'm laying down bone. So I have osteocytes living in my lacuna. I like this picture of the Haversian system or the osteon because inside you have this canal. So this is a slice through a bone. You've taken a great big bone and sliced through very, very thin so that we can put it under a microscope. Now this particular microscope is not a light microscope. This one is an electron microscope picture. So I kind of like it. But you can see the lacuna quite easily in this particular picture. And what's interesting about them is they lay down the bone in circles. So here you have, it's almost like tree rings. If you look, there's the tree rings being laid down, and you come on out, and you see more of the tree rings. So this inner part right here is called the Haversian canal. There's the lacuna, and you can't see the cells in this particular one. When they sliced it, somehow or another they lost the cells. They were in there. But what I like about this picture, can you look inside here? Right there, you see little openings all in this central canal, this Haversian canal. And the reason for that is you've got to get nutrients into these cells. So you've got these little teeny tiny canals, which we call canaliculi, and they're going in, so you're sending nutrients in to this cell, and if you were to be able to look inside there, you would see little cracks going up here, and so the nutrients can go up there, and so on. And then any waste that those cells that are trapped in the lacuna, the little lake, the waste that they need to get rid of are going to be coming down here and coming down here, and then exiting through these holes into this, and then being swept away. So you have, this is kind of neat. I like this, so you can actually see the canaliculi. You can see the little canals in there. These layers are lamella, right there. Here's a nice cartoon version. Sometimes I like to look at a cartoon version because it kind of helps you see what all is going on. So this system, this whole system where you have the haversian canal and the little canaliculi, oops, sorry about that. Well, it wants to cover the word up. There you go, canaliculi, right there. Or the little canals that are connecting the lacuna. This whole thing with the lamella and all the little osteocytes living in the lacuna, this is called an osteon, or a unit of bone. So here's one unit right here, and here's part of one unit over here. Here's a piece of one unit. So we're looking at 3 osteons, one complete and 2 of them that are partial. And this is what you would see if you looked under the microscope. You're going to see the canal in the middle, and you're going to see the lamella, the layers coming, the lacuna, the osteocyte living in the lacuna, and this is one osteon right here, and here's another little osteon right there. So here it tells you where would you find bone tissue? Well, duh, in bones. What's its function? It is to support you, obviously. We are not boneless chickens. So we have bones that support us. They are protection. So your ribs protect your very delicate lungs and your heart. The other thing you do is you store calcium in your bones. So if you go without eating stuff that has calcium, you'll literally start dissolving away your bones. I always warn my pregnant women to make sure they get plenty of calcium, because if you have a baby in there, it's got to have calcium, and it's going to be sending out signals to your body that it needs calcium, and you'll dissolve away your bones. And the next thing you know, you've dissolved away enough of your jawbone that your teeth fall out. So one of the reasons you find a lot of women who don't have teeth, but they have a lot of kids, is because they didn't realize how important it was to get the proper amount of calcium so that the baby didn't go and use your calcium out of your bones to build its bones. Be sure that you can identify number 1 is the lamella, which are the rings. There's the lamella. Number 2 is the osteocyte, which lives in the lacuna. Now all of these are little lacuna. And you need to see the canaliculi, or little canals. Canaliculi, little canals. And you can see those cracks right there. That's the canaliculi. And then the big central canal is also known as the haversian canal. And then you should be able to draw around an osteon. So there's an osteon right there. And here's an osteon right here, over there. And that's it for this chapter. Next time, you'll probably have a quiz, and we'll start talking about your skull and your axial skeleton.